Hello, everybody. It's really great to be here. This is a beautiful city, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of my interests, my early interests in cognitive therapy. One of the things I like most about conferences like these is the kind of track that Catherine puts together, is that mix of ideas, Eastern philosophy, things you haven't heard about before. So I actually studied psychology at university about 20 years ago, and came across some ideas that I found personally hugely helpful. I've had some family issues around mental health, serious depressive episodes, family members with eating disorders, and I found these techniques enormously helpful as a person. I've also found them very helpful in the work that I do. So this is the first time I've talked at a conference about sharing some of these ideas, and I was thinking, I'm a little nervous because this is maybe a different thing than technical topics, but then I'm also excited because I found these ideas have really helped me when I felt my worst and helped me through some really difficult times. So I hope that you get something out of that. I studied these ideas about 20 odd years ago, and most of the ideas I'm talking about today come from a guy called David Burns, who wrote an excellent mass market paperback called Feeling Good. And I'll promote his work throughout and give you some references to look at the end. But he was a pioneer in cognitive therapy, and cognitive therapy had this idea that the way we think can influence how we feel. And going back to it recently, though, one of the things that I was really excited about was that he discovered that these tools are very useful. So let's have a brief look at the tools, and then I'm going to talk about what he found out when he examined why they didn't always work. And I think there's a good link for us in the work we do, whether it be introducing XP or Lean or Agile or Kanban or digital transformation, as it now seems to be called. So cognitive therapy has this idea that the way we think about the world influences how we feel. And it has some fantastic tools that really help. So for example, when you're not feeling very good, if you're feeling depressed or anxious, one of the things you can do is write the thoughts that you're having down. And then you look at those thoughts and you can analyze them against some fairly common cognitive distortions. This is just a handful of them. And by spotting the distortions in your own thinking, you can often replace the negative thought with a more reasoned, rational response and ultimately improve the way you feel. And so this works really, really well. And there's loads of studies that show it works really well. There's even studies that find just picking up the book Feeling Good and reading that and doing the exercise will actually help as much as therapy. So it's undoubtedly a good thing that works. So we've got methods that help. But what David Burns found was that they didn't help everybody. And so this was a bit of a puzzle. How come some people got real benefits from this, but not all people? And so when he looked at it, what he found was there were differences around how much effort people wanted to put in to get the result, and also actually whether people wanted the result or not. Whether they really wanted this thing or not. And I was thinking, this sounds very similar to some of the work we do when we're introducing methods that really work. So we've got test-driven development or Scrum or Kanban or continuous delivery. We know these methods work. I've worked in clients that do this all the time, but sometimes they don't work so well with clients. And I was wondering whether we could learn from the same thing that was happening in therapy, where they discovered that instead of starting with the tools and pushing the tools to offer help, David Burns has this great line that most therapy fails because of the therapist's desire to fix and help. And I'm wondering, could that play in our world too? Could most transformation or adoption fail because we as practitioners are so keen to push these methods that we know help on clients? Instead, what they've looked at is looking at outcome resistance. Is there actually a resistance within the patient to using these methods to achieve the outcome, and trying to find ways before you get to the tools where you can bring that resistance into conscious awareness. And what I'm really interested in is whether that would work in our world. So one of the tools to bring things into resistance, into conscious awareness, is a cost-benefit analysis. So you might be thinking about making a change from where you are today, the status quo. And traditionally, what you do is look at the advantages and disadvantages of staying as you are, and then the advantages and disadvantages of making a change. And this is pretty common, but what I find really interesting is David Burns' argument is rather than focusing on the disadvantages of today and the advantages of change, to do the opposite, which is, I said in the talk description, I wanted to talk about common approaches that don't work. I think if you look at how we try and introduce change to a team, an organization, a company, often you see advice like this: create a burning platform for change. Which starts with the idea that you need to tell people the problems with where they are today, the problems with the status quo, and then focus on the benefits of change. One of the talks here yesterday sort of said, what you need to do is to be an evangelist. Okay? You need to push the benefits of the change. What I find interesting to consider, though, is what about if we went the other way, and we paradoxically, rather than, as people offering to come in as like scrum masters or consultants or just working within a team, rather than focusing on the disadvantages of today and trying to push for benefits in future, what if we went the other way and said, before we do that, what we'd like to do is just to start by looking at what are the advantages that you might be getting from staying exactly as you are, and what are the disadvantages to trying to change. So as a thought experiment that relates to a client that I'm with, they've asked, this is slightly fictionalized, they've asked us to come in and help them do continuous delivery. And we've done this in other organizations and had some super results, 60 teams deploying whenever they like, hundreds of times a day to production with microservices architecture. But it's not working in this fictional example as well as I'd like. What I'd like to do is that I think what would be better is, rather than saying, here are all the advantages of continuous delivery and here are the reasons why you should change, the benefits that you're going to get, we could do what they do in the therapy. So what they do now when someone comes in and says they're depressed or they're anxious and they'd like help, they first start by saying, before we do that, we'd like to find out some of the benefits that you're getting from being depressed. And what is it that's beautiful and wonderful about you that you're depressed? And this is a very deep form of empathy. If you can help someone highlight the actual benefits, and this isn't sarcastic, so it might be like, for example, you can conserve energy, okay? Or you're going to be a realist. You're going to deal with real situations. And then look at the disadvantages of changing. And so the benefits there is it helps the client make a more reasoned decision about whether in fact they want to change by bringing to conscious awareness some of the things that they might lose by changing. So, like for example, if we played the thought experiment that you wanted to move from weekly releases to daily releases, what do you think the advantages of only releasing weekly are? Anyone got some ideas from the floor? Sorry? Stability, yep. It's more stable if you only release once a week, yep. Less risk to your systems, yep. Any other advantages of using your energy to do anything other than move to daily releases? Okay, the status quo. Takes less time, because, just say a bit more. Exactly, you're going to spend less of your week doing that deployment, that's for sure, absolutely. And what about some disadvantages of moving to daily releases? Yep, so the disadvantage of moving to daily releases is you might need to hide things until they're the day they're released, so it might be a bit more complicated, yep. Yep, so you might be pushing change faster than customers want it, yep, great. Any more? Change fatigue, say some more. Yeah, exactly. One of the things I noticed in my consultancy is that we all think daily releases is the bee's knees, or whenever you like, because we love that lifestyle. But I think we've forgotten just how chaotic it is. Like Catherine said earlier, the problem with constant improvement is it's really, really tiring. And so thank you very much for those advantages and disadvantages. My theory here is that if we are able to surface this kind of discussion with clients, what they've found in therapy is that when you get to actually using the methods and tools, there's far less resistance from the client because it switches the relationship. It makes it paradoxical. Rather than pushing help on a client and being responsible as the therapist, it's actually the client's active decision to do it, or potentially not. I mean, if a client decides this isn't for them, I think that's a great outcome. And the position is to sit with open hands and say, we understand the benefits that you're getting from staying as you are and not changing. Is there anything else that you'd like help with? Okay, can we help you with something else? So I'm super excited about this, and I'm looking to use this in retrospectives and other things with clients. And I apologize for not having examples. I like to usually show examples of having finished, but I'm hoping that I might inspire people in the audience to think about using this approach, this paradoxical agenda setting approach. Okay, so I want to quickly go back and look at how I learnt about this and also to illustrate my failures. So it's interesting that the Agile manifesto talks about individuals and interactions over processes and tools. It was funny how far I had to go to realize the limits of the tools and methods that I was using and some of the failures I was making. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is to show the benefits of focusing on both relationships and communication. And I'll finish up by talking about some secrets of effective communication that you can use to increase your chances of being effective in helping people change. So this is me about 10 years ago. I was in an investment bank. I was told they didn't like Agile, so I decided to do it anyway. We did a stand-up in the fire escape every day. It was very confusing, but it worked very well. We had a mobile Scrum board at the start, and we learned amazing things like if you track work by people, people show that they're very busy. And so we changed that to just pin people to the work, and then we looked at how we could increase flow and looked at other groups that we needed to work with to deliver value, and obsessively looked at measurement, read all the books in order to try and produce great change. And we did, I'll ask you to take it on faith, we did very well delivering effective change. But it got to the point where it wasn't as effective as I'd like. We were doing a lot of releases and building a lot of products, but they weren't really being used by customers. And so what I decided to do was to try and use data, because I thought data will change people's minds, it will influence them. And I'm all about using reasoned decision-making approaches. And so what I'll do is I'll illustrate the problem using data. But the problem is it's quite a naive approach to change. It's a bit like saying to change weight, all you need is a scale. The scale gives you accurate and correct measurement, but it's not enough on its own to produce a change for humans. And we know this, but I still think there's not enough discussion in our communities about actual approaches we can use that will help us communicate more effectively within relationships. So I drew this graph that showed that we'd built 27 products over 660 days, and I looked at the lean idea of how long they took in development. And what I wanted to try and illustrate was that we'd been under a lot of pressure to deliver products that eventually weren't used. So they sat there, and they were taking longer and they were harder to build, and I was feeling really demotivated. So what I was trying to do was generate discussion using this data, but it didn't lead to the outcome that I wanted. And I initially became very defensive and blamed the books and thought leaders, and I went after them in person at conference to hunt them down and criticize them or try and get them to help, but it didn't really help. And then it was only after the fact that I became really interested in terms of working with people. One of the key bits of data is the discussion that you had. So it's not enough just to have the bathroom scales, the measurement. You actually need to be able to talk about it effectively. And so to illustrate one of my failures, this was the conversation that I had with that graph at a steering group meeting. So in a slightly joking voice, I said, I think this may be the best graph I ever produced. And I explained it like I did to you before. And I thought it might be interesting to review here. And the sponsor said, this graph shows how well the technical team has done and how badly we've made business decisions. I was like, oh God, he's feeling criticized. There's no way I can get anywhere with this. So I sort of punted and said, okay, well, maybe we can talk about it later. Let's move on. Okay, and that was the end of it. Okay, I spent more time talking about this graph at conferences than I actually did with someone that could have made a difference to the process. But at the time, I was like, these processes don't work. The data isn't enough. And then I slowly became interested in how I might be contributing to the scenario. Because I was saying, I spent a lot of time in pubs in London talking to Catherine and other people, complaining about the kind of managers at my organization and how they just didn't get it. They asked for change, but they didn't want it. It was all their fault. And then I came across some ideas around how humans relate, again from David Burns, that I really like. So his idea is that we provoke and maintain the exact relationship problems that we complain about. But we don't like to realize this because we like to feel like victims and say it's all the other person's fault. Now, I remember going to a conference and trying to understand how someone else could be labeled like a sheep, a cow, or a fox, to understand political behavior so that I could influence them better, and I think I was just pointing in the wrong direction. To illustrate that claim, though, about creating the environment we want, I used to tell people that it was a toxic political environment in this organization. But the funniest thing for me now, looking back on it, is that I thought this was just pure data, this graph. But I can't tell you, well, I can tell you, sorry. I can tell you, it took me 2 hours to color that graph to make sure that the bad things were in red. And so here I was doing a toxic political action in the sense that I was just trying to criticize and highlight the errors that I thought the business people had made, and yet I would tell you that I wasn't involved. But there I was creating the environment that I was complaining about. The second of 3 ideas around how people relate is that we deny our own role in the conflict because we're rewarded by the problem that we complain about. It was a lot of fun to go to pubs in London, meet-up groups, and just say, I need to tell you that they're impossible. And I got so much sympathy and so many hugs, and people are like, man, maybe you've just got a really bad client. You know, these managers, they're the bad ones. And the other thing is that self-examination is shocking and painful, and I can relate to this from first-hand experience. One of the experiences I had with this client was that I was running a steering group committee after that graph, and they asked me how long the next product was going to take. And one of my peers afterwards said to me, Benjamin, you know in that meeting when they said, when's the next product ready? What date's it going to be finished? How many seconds was it between them asking you that question and you biting their heads off? My initial response was, hey, I wasn't biting anyone's head off. And then I was like, he wouldn't have asked me that question if I wasn't in fact biting people's heads off. So it did feel shocking and painful, but I was curious because I thought this was my best lever for change. And so at the next place I went to, I'd become an Agile coach at this stage. I asked if I could tape my interactions in the workshops I was running for training purposes, like when you ring on the phone and they record it for training purposes. And I did one meeting that went very poorly, and I knew it was bad at the time, but I couldn't quite work out why. But I thought, never mind, I've recorded it. I'm going to listen to it tonight in the hotel room, and maybe it will contain some information that I could learn from. And then there was a moment in the hotel when I suddenly remembered what I'd said and done as I was playing it back. And it was so shocking and painful, I had to rip the headphones out of my ears, and my heart rate was going about 180 because I realized, and this amazed me, I'd forgotten it all day, even though I knew I was going to look at it. I'd forgotten what I'd said, but I yelled at someone. Someone had suggested an idea, and I'd said, no, don't say it like that, because I didn't like his language, which was stunning, because I wouldn't tell you that that's effective behavior, and I wouldn't encourage anyone that that's a great Agile coaching method, and yet I did it without any effort. It came effortlessly from me, and then I forgot that I'd done it. So this really tipped me off to this amazing insight that we've known since the dawn of time, but it's worth reflecting on, and it's very painful when it's about you. That was my experience, that how we act, how we think we act, and how we tell others we act are very different than how we actually act. And it can be, people talk about the death of the ego to reference a Buddha idea, and it's really hard, particularly if you're employed to be good at communication, your identity is wrapped up in being a good coach. It's even more painful to discover the evidence, and the tape recorder doesn't lie about your own behavior. So it was shocking and painful, but the positive side of it is that it enables this third thing, so that the idea that we create the thing that we complain about and we don't like to look at our own involvement in it, those are pretty negative. But the positive part of this is that we have a lot more power than we think to transform relationships. And that's a key thing, I think. If we want a better culture, I believe it starts with our behavior. And a great source of insight is to try and spot these errors between how we think we're acting and how we're actually acting by looking at them. And so to reframe that another way, the positivity is, if you're not part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. You know, I can't tell you how desperate I was when I was thinking, is this leader a sheep, a fox, a cow? How do I react to him? What words do I use that would make a cow person respond? I had nowhere really to go there, whereas understanding about the errors that I was making in my behavior made it much easier. So the thing is, I would claim if you want better communication, it comes within the context of a relationship. So I think it's quite interesting to bring in these theories from couples therapy, really. It's not about doing couples therapy, obviously, when you're trying to introduce new ways of working inside a team. But the model, I think, has some utility. So when you're in a troubled relationship, you've got 3 sort of options about what you might do. The first one is just to keep the status quo as it is and just see what time does. You might do that because it's too difficult to end the relationship. You don't want to switch teams, switch roles, do something else. Or you could decide to make it work better. And there's no one right situation in all scenarios, so that's not what I'm saying. But I do think the greatest lever we've got in many situations is to stay in the relationship and work to make it better. And then we have 3 ways that we could do that. And so the most common one is to wait for the other person to change first. Yeah, I'm all for change. It's like self-organization. I'd like you as a team to self-organize. If you could do it my way, that would be great. Okay, so we wait for the other person to change, or maybe if you get tired of that or predict it will take too long, you might think, right, we need to actively start trying to change this other person. But I'd just like to do a straw poll. Put up your hand if you'd like to be changed by someone else. Okay. Look, and whatever answer is fine, but for the record, only one person half put up their hand. It's unlikely if we did take that approach based on ourselves, unless we're a really interesting population, it's unlikely that it's going to work with others. And so then the key thing, I think, is that you've got to, the key area is focusing on changing yourself. But what's I find amazing about this is the way our brains are wired. This is really hard work, particularly when you're in a relationship with another human and it's not working very well. How are we going to change ourselves? And so I wanted to conduct a thought experiment. I want you to think of someone that you might work with. You can choose whatever scenario you like, but let's, if you like, focus on a work scenario. Let's think about someone that you need to influence or work with to agree a change at work that you really don't like. It might be someone that's really critical, an old school project manager, someone asking you when's it going to be done. Okay, I want you to picture that person, and then as a thought experiment, I want you, and this is showing this idea about outcome resistance. Let's imagine that I had a magic button, and if you press that magic button, you'd instantly have a beautiful, warm, close relationship with this person. Okay, you'd be best friends, and it wouldn't require any effort on your part. This is completely effort-free, but it would be transformational. All you need to do is press that button. Put up. Can I have a show of hands if you're willing to show your hands? Who would press that button? Interesting. And who would not press that button? Okay. And so this is the thing, isn't it? You've been offered love and joy for free, and yet people are saying no to it. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. That's human nature. There are some people I've worked with, and I thought their behavior was so appalling, I would just prefer never to work with them again. Right? Life's too short. And if you said to me, Benjamin, we can fix the relationship, I've got some magic tools, I'd say, fair dues, I don't want them. Okay? So, but I do think it's interesting because sometimes we model that humans are really positive. You know, we have a very good view of people, trust people, they'll do well. Actually, we're quite dark at times. You know, we're vindictive, we're competitive, we're nasty, we're backstabbing, or we appear that way. We're out for dominance. And so this is an interesting thing. So that was an example of testing whether someone would be interested in achieving the outcome, just like that paradoxical agenda setting. And what we're trying to do is bring to the fore reasons why people might not want the outcome that they're asking for with the change. And the idea is if you can bring that out earlier, you're going to waste far less time pushing help or pushing change on a group. And the second idea is when you think about that relationship with a person that you don't like, can I have another show of hands? Who thinks that the other person is more responsible for that? Who thinks the other person is more responsible? Who thinks they're responsible? Okay, so not many comments, but a mix. So the third and final idea in terms of ideas around framing relationships, the first two were that we create the situation. The second one was that we don't like to look at our own behavior. The third is a positive idea that we can make more, we have much more power than we think to transform those relationships. But to do that, there are two key conditions. We need to stop blaming the other person. Because blame is like kryptonite. It completely obliviates any of these tools. It's just, if you're focused on the other person being the cause of the problem, it's probably better to try and pick another relationship and go work on that. Don't waste your time. And then the other thing is that the focus, and you might find this unfair or unreasonable or difficult, is to focus on changing ourselves because you've got much bigger levers in that direction. Okay, so just recapping what we've done. I'm talking about some ideas from cognitive therapy where they are interested in, before using tools to create effective change, they first check whether the client really wants this. They test outcome resistance, either using paradoxical agenda setting, looking at the advantages of remaining as you are and the disadvantages of changing, or things like the magic button. And it's only once they've agreed that with the client, and if the client says, and then the therapist puts the question back, do you really want to change? And you can play a devil's advocate position. You could say, given all these advantages of staying the same and the disadvantages of changing, I'm just not clear genuinely, honestly, why is it that you think you'd like to change? And so it switches the roles. I think that this is a very exciting idea to play in the work we do with teams and with organizations when thinking about a new change. Like, do you want continuous delivery? If you say before we start that, let's just go check. Would you really want to get rid of all that? And thank you for those great examples. So the third thing I wanted to focus on is some practical tools and methods that you can use to improve communication. Best applied once you've agreed, if you're using them on someone else, once you've agreed that you want to do them. And you might even do the thought experiment yourself of that paradoxical agenda setting thing. So I'm going to show you some methods that really do improve the way you can communicate. But before you do it, it might be worth asking what are the benefits of staying as you are, not learning these new communication methods, and the disadvantages of starting to change. Because some of the disadvantages, you might find that you really don't communicate very effectively right now. And that could be painful or surprising. I know for a while I used to collect stories of other people acting poorly just to make myself feel better, because I felt shocking that I behaved as poorly as in fact I had. So I'll leave that as a thought experiment. Let's get on with it. So the 5 secrets of good communication. So David Burns has a pithy model called listen with your ear. So there are 3 key aspects to a good communication. One is empathy, understanding how the world looks from someone else's perspective. The second one is assertiveness, so sharing your feelings and thoughts openly with the other person. And the third one is respect, so communicating a respect for the other person as a human, even if you disagree with them and even if you feel like you're in the heat of battle. And bad communication is obviously the reverse. You hide your feelings or act them out aggressively. You don't listen. You argue defensively that they are wrong. And then respect, you don't focus on respect, you just go to war. You're here to take that person down. Okay, so these break down into 5 key skills that I'm going to go through in the next slide. So the disarming technique, thought and feeling empathy and inquiry, and then I feel statements, affirmation or stroking. So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour. I hope just to introduce these ideas and then encourage you to follow up with some of the material that I'll show at the end if you're interested. So the first one is a stunning technique called the disarming technique. So it looks at finding a way to find a grain of truth in what someone else is saying to you, even if it seems blatantly wrong, illogical, or exaggerated. And this is the law of, this plays into the law of opposites. You know, as a thought experiment, if someone says, you're not listening to me, and you say, oh, I am, you've actually proved them right, okay? So if you act defensively when you feel attacked, you actually prove your critic correct, okay? Whereas if you disarm them by agreeing with them and saying, you know, you're absolutely right, I feel awful about it, I'd love to be able to listen really well, and it sounds like in this case I'm just not doing that, can you tell me more about it? It completely changes the nature of that interaction, much like for those born in the 80s, the Karate Kid, yeah? That you don't sort of oppose something, you just let it go through. So the challenge though with this is that it can be hard to find truth in what the other person's saying because it can just seem so damn wrong. That it's not unreasonable to take a day or more to find some truth in what the other person's saying. The other one is doing it in a patronizing way. You know, I can see how you might feel that way. Okay, that's not disarming, that's patronizing, or defending yourself. Okay, so empathy. So this is the idea of putting yourself in the other person's shoes and trying to see the world through their eyes. Dan North told me the joke that if you're ever in a difficult scenario, you should practice empathy, you know, take 10 minutes and walk in their shoes. The advantage is that you'll be 10 minutes away from them and you'll have their shoes. Yeah? So, boom, boom. So there's 2 types of empathy. We want to empathize with how someone is thinking, and this really involves paraphrasing. So saying back the words you heard from that person to reflect and show them that in fact you did hear them and you understand them. Amazingly how useful that tool is. It's almost a superpower of mine. Just paraphrasing something back. If you want to run an experiment, just sit in a meeting and count how many times someone else checks that they heard what someone else said. What you find is far more common is the model of communication, which is I'm speaking now, and then when I finish speaking, it's your turn to say more words back at me. People hardly ever give up their turn to generously reflect back what they've heard from another person. And then feeling empathy is acknowledging how the other person is probably feeling based on what they said. We can't often know for sure. And Burns does some great stuff where he asked therapists to sit with clients for 2 hours and talk to them about how they felt, and then he asked the patient and the therapist separately to rate the feelings. There was no correlation. They would have done, and these were people that had been trained for 3 years to be counselors. They would have had more luck asking a random taxi driver how the patient felt than that. So even therapists who've trained at this do appallingly badly at it, so don't feel bad if you find that you need to practice this skill. Some errors, though, with this is that you might be stereotyped or mechanical in your response. You need to be authentic, and that does take practice. Failing to use feeling words, especially anger. People often feel differently about using these things at work. So you might need to use sort of substitute words if feeling words are too much. But it can be hard to recognize that someone's feeling really angry. And then criticizing the other person instead of just reflecting back how they think and feel. The final empathy skill, we're talking about this, listen with your ear, so empathy is the first of the three areas. The final skill is inquiry, which is asking gentle, genuine, is my addition here, probing questions to learn more about how the other person is thinking or feeling. And the goal here is that most people know the idea of seek first to understand and then be understood, but it's quite common in challenging situations to throw that completely out the window and just focus on forcing the other person to hear what you've got to say. So it's done very little. I even ran a retrospective with an Agile team where we focused on asking questions. And we spent 10 minutes and I recorded it and we transcribed it. There was one question and it was rhetorical. Okay? So it is much harder. It took me about a year to master the art of asking questions at work. It's really hard work to ask proper, genuine, open questions. Some of the problems are going to solution too quickly. So if someone is talking to you something, you might try and get them to help problem solve it immediately. So what could I do different, or how can we solve this problem? It's usually too early at this point. It's usually too early. It's better just to listen and ask questions where your goal is to get them to say more about something. And also some of the other errors are things like apologizing. Okay, so those were the empathy skills. So listen with your ear, empathy, assertion, respect. Assertion is basically using I statements to express your own thoughts and feelings openly and directly. Importantly, using words that describe your emotions. And so the challenge here is that often people think they're saying feeling words, but they're actually sharing thoughts. And the key one is framing it as you statements. So what I feel is you're being difficult. Okay, it's not a thought, it's not about you, okay, so that's a fail. And it's unlikely to produce a very good outcome, or I feel like you're not listening. Some of the challenges are lashing out and putting the other person down, so using your feelings as a weapon, rather than just doing it in the spirit of sharing the information with the other person. And another error that people often make is they're afraid to talk about how they feel because they don't think they should feel that way. So there's a distortion on their side, there's a phobia about sharing feelings. So the final part of listen with your ear, empathy, assertion, respect is respect. So this is really important. I think it relates back to some Buddhist ideas that Catherine was talking about. It's trying to change the nature of the interaction from you and seeing the other person just as a thing, an obstacle, a problem that needs to be overcome, and instead recognizing the connection with them as a human. So the goal is to be able to express positive regard for the other person no matter how upset you feel. And I found this one a real challenge to learn, but one of the things I got was a friend of mine was an ex-policeman, and he was telling me actually how it made a difference between life and death, that policemen are often in highly volatile, violent situations. If they don't communicate respect to the other person, even though they might be behaving appallingly, it increases the threat and the risk of the situation that they're in. So I watch a lot of those terrible TV dramas where they follow police around just to watch how other people continue to be respectful of someone even if they're behaving appallingly. And one of the key things here is this irony that we all want to be respected and loved, but we're often not willing to give it to someone, particularly when we disagree with them. So that's respect. And so those are the three skills. I wanted to show you how to use them. I think these play so usefully. I've got more complicated theories and ideas, but this is the one that I found most successful. So I wanted to show, as a final thing, how we might use these. And let's look back at the interaction that I had before. So we're going to use the 5 secrets of effective communication and show how to use them to improve a situation. So the first step is to write down what was said. And it's funny how much we try and do this work in our heads and not put it on paper. It's really painful. You can do it from an audio recording or just from your memory. That's fine. Write down what you said. Second step is write down what they said. So this is the same dialogue from before. The third one is to bring in these 5 secrets of effective communication and ask yourself the question, in my communication, did I demonstrate good communication or bad communication? So just rattling through them here, did I show the disarming technique anywhere there? Did I show any thought or feeling empathy? Did I show any inquiry? Did I ask any questions? No. Any I feel statements? Did I assert how I was thinking or feeling? No. In fact, I hid what I was feeling. I thought this was a crazy situation. I was really frustrated, but didn't mention any of that. And did I reflect affirmation or stroking or respect for the other person? I don't think so. Okay, so it's none for 5 at this stage. So the next step is to think about what were the consequences. So how did it feel for me, the other person in the relationship? And my sense is here, this person probably found me like unhelpful, critical, not clear, and so was therefore unlikely to want to continue to collaborate with me or have a conversation. So those are pretty much things I didn't want in this scenario. So then I can go to the 5th step, which is to use those skills to generate a different response. And I will stress in the next point, it's amazing how much practice this takes. It really does take practice to write stuff down. You won't get it perfect. Here's an attempt I made. So instead of saying, I'm just going to do it at the end. So, okay, instead of saying, okay, maybe we can talk about it later, let's move on. What I could have said is, when they said, this graph shows the technical team has done well and how badly we've made business decisions, I could have said, you're right. You know, I did want to highlight products that we'd built that weren't used. I can imagine that you're feeling annoyed at being criticized for making bad business decisions. And I just want to say how much I value being part of this team and want to help build products that you value. And I am confused about some of the product choices that we've made. Could I set up a meeting to find out about what product we might be building next and your thoughts about why you've chosen that? So I don't think that's perfect, but I'll leave it to you to reflect. Would I have been more likely to affect a change in that situation? And I think I definitely would have. And I know there are other examples I could show where I've used these skills to great effect. So we're just on time. So one last thing, which is really, this takes practice. It takes about the same. It's funny, people don't think it should somehow because we've been talking our whole lives, communicating our whole lives. Do I really need to practice? Yes, you do. And it's the same thing as thinking, like, how hard is it to learn tennis or swimming? Like, it's like if you, and you will need to practice at these, like playing the notes on a piano. You know, all of these 5 skills are notes on the piano. In order to make beautiful music, you need to work at combining them together. It's not enough to hit the piano a few times. I just can't make music. There's no way that good sound can come out of that. So practice. You can do that with other people. You could ask them to play the role of someone you'd like to communicate better with. Pick one of the skills individually. Get them to say one thing at you and practice that skill in response. And then ask them to say, how well did you do? And keep practicing. I would encourage you to do that if you're interested in this. So the summary is, I hope that you found the idea of focusing on the paradoxical agenda setting, asking people to defend, if you like, why they want to change and the disadvantages of change before you push the reasons to change and the downsides of their status quo. I hope you got the point that introducing change relies on communications and having good relationships with key people, and that you found the 5 secrets of effective communication interesting and thought-provoking, and you're encouraged now to go and practice them. If you'd like to find out more, these are all the books that David Burns has written, and he does an amazing job. He's done recently a podcast out where he shows therapy sessions with his students that show some amazing scenarios, like how could you change your thinking if you've got stage 4 cancer? And he does a 2-hour session that proves these ideas, which is the strongest test of data. You can listen to him doing what he's claiming and seeing what the results are for yourself. The podcast is an absolute thrill. At 3 p.m. Eastern time, if I'm right, in the US, he does a Facebook show, which is also brilliant. I'm just so impressed with the quality of output that he's got. If you'd like to find out more, I'd encourage you to look at one of them. And the final thing was, I realized how important this was to me in my own life, that one of these books actually helped me meet my wife. That I was too anxious to go and talk to women that I didn't know and thought it would be horrifying, and they'd talk about anxiety exercises you can do, and like thinking, why can't I just turn around and my feet direct me in her direction? And that is in fact what I did when I met my wife 15 years ago. So it's had a huge personal impact on me and continues to be good professionally and with the clients. So final thing is, if you've enjoyed that, please remember to rate this session because coming over here from London has meant that I can visit my only nephew in the world who lives in New York, and if I get a bad evaluation, I may not be allowed to come back. Thank you very much.